On a fateful September night in 2010, a horrific highway collision abruptly ended the life of Robert Schimmel. To his audience, he was a legend, named one of the 100 greatest stand-up comedians of all time by Comedy Central, a true maverick of the HBO stage with his hit special Unprotected, and a familiar face who could make even titans like Howard Stern and Conan O'Brien erupt in laughter. The world was shocked by his tragic death at 60, but what they didn't know was that the horrific accident was merely the cruel final curtain on a tragedy that had been smoldering for decades. Because the real life of Robert Schimmel was a brutal battlefield, a place where he had to battle the demon of cancer, drown in the ashes of broken marriages, and confront shocking scandals from his love affairs. So, who truly was this clown with a broken heart? Robert Schimmel was born on January 16, 1950, into a world still piecing itself together after the war. He grew up in the Bronx, a borough of New York City that was a melting pot of grit and ambition. His was a typical Jewish American upbringing for the time. His father was a shoe store owner, and his mother was a war survivor. The household was not one of privilege, but one of survival, and humor was a form of currency. It was in this environment that Schimmel learned the rhythms of storytelling and the power of a well-timed, often cynical, observation. The post-war era was a time of burgeoning optimism in America, of suburban dreams and picket fences, but in the dense working-class neighborhoods of the Bronx, life was a little more complicated, a little less polished. It was this lack of polish that would come to define Schimmel's entire identity. Unlike many of his comedic contemporaries, who were drawn to the stage from a young age, Schimmel took a much more circuitous route. He didn't have a burning youthful ambition to be a star. He had a life to live first, and that meant getting a job and starting a family. For many years, he was a stereo salesman in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a respectable, stable life. He got married to his first wife, Vicky, and they had a family. On the surface, it was the American dream, a far cry from the concrete playgrounds of the Bronx. He had a wife, children, a house, a steady income. But beneath the surface of this conventional life, a different voice was waiting to get out. It was a voice that saw the absurdity in the everyday, the darkness in the mundane, and the inherent comedy in human fallibility. Working in retail, Schimmel was a frontline observer of human behavior. He saw people's pretensions, their insecurities, their strange demands. He honed his observational skills not in smoky comedy clubs, but on the showroom floor. The stories he would later tell on stage about outrageous customers and bizarre workplace scenarios were born from this period. He started doing open mic nights, tentatively at first, testing out the voice that had been rattling around in his head for years. And people listened. More than that, they laughed. They laughed with the kind of guttural, explosive release that comes from hearing someone say something you've thought but never dared to articulate. The comedy scene of the late 1970s and early 1980s was a landscape in transition. The classic suit and tie joke tellers of the old guard were giving way to a new generation of observational and confessional comics. It was the era of George Carlin's linguistic deconstruction, Richard Pryor's searing social commentary, and a young Jerry Seinfeld's quirky observations. Into this world stepped Robert Schimmel, a middle-aged stereo salesman with a wife and kids who looked less like a budding star and more like someone's disgruntled uncle. But he had an edge they didn't. His comedy wasn't just observational, it was invasively personal. The turning point, the moment that elevated him from a local Arizona comic to a nationally recognized name, came through the patronage of a comedy kingmaker, Rodney Dangerfield. Dangerfield, famous for his I don't get no respect persona, had an impeccable eye for raw, authentic talent. He saw in Schimmel a kindred spirit, a man who seemed perpetually at odds with the world, who channeled his frustrations into a relentless barrage of comedy. Dangerfield gave Schimmel the ultimate validation by inviting him to perform on his HBO Young Comedian special in 1986. Appearing on that special was like being anointed. Suddenly, Schimmel was no longer just a guy telling jokes in Scottsdale. He was a professional comedian, endorsed by one of the masters. This opened the doors to late-night television. With appearances on shows like Late Night with David Letterman and The Tonight Show, but it was on a newer, edgier talk show that he would find his most welcoming home. Late Night with Conan O'Brien. Schimmel became one of Conan's favorite guests. There was a palpable chemistry between the buttoned-up Ivy League host and the crass, brutally honest comic from the Bronx. Conan seemed genuinely delighted by Schimmel's ability to say the absolute worst thing at any given moment. During his numerous appearances, Schimmel would sit on the couch and casually unload stories about his vasectomy, his sex life with his wife, and his general dissatisfaction with the world, all while Conan howled with laughter, often burying his face in his hands in mock despair. The audience loved it. They were seeing something real, something dangerous, something that felt like it could fly off the rails at any second. His style was often labeled blue comedy or shock jock, but those terms don't quite do it justice. It wasn't just about being dirty for the sake of it. Schimmel's comedy was a radical act of confession. He operated on the principle that if it happened to him, he had the right to talk about it, and nothing was off limits. His own body, his wife, his children, his deepest insecurities, it was all material. His first HBO special, Hardcore in the Big Apple, solidified this persona. He wasn't telling jokes in the traditional sense. He was weaving a narrative of his own chaotic life. He was the beleaguered husband, the confused father, the middle-aged man whose body was starting to betray him. He was a pioneer of what would later be called TMI, or too much information comedy. He laid the groundwork for future comedians like Louis C.K. and Mark Maron, who would build entire careers on the foundation of radical, uncomfortable honesty. For a time, life was good. He was a successful touring comedian. He had a loving family, with children Arik, Derek, and Jessica. He had the respect of his peers and a growing fan base who appreciated his unflinching candor. But the very thing that made his comedy so potent, its deep connection to the turmoil of his real life, was about to take a series of dark and destructive turns. The life that had been his greatest source of material was about to become his greatest source of pain, and he would be forced to navigate a series of tragedies that would test the limits of his humor and his will to survive. The first major blow wasn't a scandal or a divorce. It was a silent, creeping threat from within his own body. In the late 1990s, while at the peak of his touring success, Robert Schimmel suffered a heart attack. The heart attack was not a gentle warning. It was a violent, full-body detonation. For a man like Robert Schimmel, whose entire stage presence was built on a kind of manic, agitated, hyperverbal energy, the sudden, crushing silence from within his own chest was the ultimate betrayal. He was in his late 40s, at the absolute zenith of his career as a touring comedian. He was selling out clubs. His HBO special had solidified his brand of caustic truth-telling, and his appearances on Conan O'Brien's show had made him a beloved figure of late-night chaos. He was a man in constant motion, both physically on stage and verbally, with a mind that never seemed to stop churning out grievances and observations. Then one day his body simply said, no. The experience was not abstract or distant. It was a profound and terrifying physical event. The cliche of an elephant sitting on one's chest was, he would later discover, a woefully inadequate metaphor. It was more like a vice, a relentless crushing pressure that radiated outward, accompanied by a cold sweat and the terrifying metallic taste of fear. In the sterile, impersonal environment of a hospital emergency room, the comedian was stripped away, leaving only the mortal man. The rapid-fire wit was replaced by the slow, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The control he exerted on stage, where he was the master of the narrative, vanished. He was now a passive participant in a drama directed by cardiologists and nurses, his body a territory to be mapped and managed by others. For a man who built his entire career on discussing every intimate, embarrassing, and undignified detail of his life, from his bowel movements to his sexual failures, a major health crisis should have been, on some level, just more grist for the mill. But this was different. This wasn't a comical misunderstanding with his wife or a funny anecdote about the aging process. This was a direct confrontation with the void, a glimpse into the abyss. The fear was real, palpable, and not remotely funny. Yet true to his nature, once the immediate danger had passed and he was left to recover, Schimmel began the alchemical process that defined his genius. He started to transform terror into comedy. He lay in his hospital bed and began taking mental notes. The indignity of the bedpan, the nonsensical questions from interns, the blandness of the hospital food, it all became part of a new narrative. His return to the stage was not a tentative one. He walked into the spotlight and addressed the elephant in the room with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He took the terrifying, life-altering experience of a myocardial infarction and dissected it with the same brutal honesty he applied to everything else. He described the pain with excruciating detail, the sheer panic of believing your life is ending, and the absurd banality of the hospital procedures designed to save you. He turned the sterile, frightening world of angioplasty and beta blockers into a new backdrop for his signature brand of gallows humor. The jokes were dark, uncomfortable, and hysterically funny. He would talk about the moment he realized he was having a heart attack, and his first thought being, "Great, now I have to cancel my gig in Poughkeepsie." He joked about the attractive nurse and the deep humiliation of being a middle-aged man utterly at her mercy. By laughing at his own brush with death, he was asserting his dominance over it. It was a profoundly defiant act, a message sent directly to the universe. You can try to kill me, but I will get a solid 10 minutes of new material out of the attempt. The heart attack didn't soften his comedy. It deepened it. It added a new layer of existential poignancy beneath the crass, observational exterior. His act was no longer just the comedy of a disgruntled husband and father. It was now the comedy of a survivor, a man who had stared into the abyss and had come back with notes. As he recovered and threw himself back into the grueling schedule of a road comic, his career continued to thrive. But the near-death experience had shifted something fundamental, both in him and in the life he had built. The foundations of his personal world, which had always seemed to be held together with the sheer force of his personality, were beginning to show deep and irreparable cracks. His marriage to Vicky, the central relationship that had been the subject of so many of his jokes, routines, and on-air confessions for decades, was falling apart in reality. The reasons for any marital breakdown are a complex tapestry of private pains and resentments. But for the Schimmels, it was all happening under the bizarre and intense pressure of having their private life serve as the raw material for a public performance. For years, Vicky had been a character in his act, the long-suffering wife, the foil to his chaotic energy. But a character can be managed. A real person has their own pain and their own breaking point. The constant exposure the transformation of intimate arguments into punchlines, and the relentless pace of his career had taken a profound toll. The heart attack may have been the final stressor on a structure that was already buckling. In the year 2000, after more than 2 decades of marriage and 3 children together, Robert and Vicki Schimmel divorced. For any family, a divorce is a private tragedy, a painful redrawing of the map of one's life. But Robert Schimmel's life was never truly private, and what happened next would not only ensure his divorce was a public spectacle, but would transform his family's private pain into a national scandal, creating a wound so deep it would never fully heal, and a controversy that would shadow him for the rest of his days. Shortly after the divorce was finalized, Schimmel began a new relationship. This in itself was hardly unusual for a newly single man, but the identity of the woman was a bombshell that detonated in the center of his family. Her name was Melissa, and she was just 26 years old. The age difference was significant, but it was her connection to the family that made the situation catastrophic. Melissa was a close friend of his 25-year-old daughter, Jessica. To his children, who were already reeling from the dissolution of their parents' marriage, this news was an unimaginable betrayal. For Jessica, it was a profound and devastating violation of trust. The man who was her father, newly separated from her mother, was now dating one of her best friends, a young woman who had been in their home, who had shared secrets with her, who was part of her inner circle. The family imploded. The carefully constructed, if chaotic, world Schimmel had built was shattered into a million pieces. Jessica, who had always been close to her father, was heartbroken and incandescent with fury. She did not suffer this betrayal in silence. She publicly condemned him, severing all ties and speaking to the press, including an appearance on the Howard Stern show, to voice her pain and sense of betrayal. The story was tailor-made for the burgeoning world of internet gossip and talk radio, a messy, salacious, and deeply uncomfortable family drama involving a famous comedian. Schimmel, true to his lifelong creed of radical, unflinching honesty, did not hide from the scandal. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He took it to the stage. He incorporated the entire sordid story into his act, attempting to find the comedy in a situation that was causing his own children immense and very public pain. He joked about the age difference, about the absurdity of dating a woman who was the same age as his daughter, and about the sheer chaos of his new life. To some in the audience, it was just another outrageous chapter in the saga of Robert Schimmel, another shocking confession from a man who had no filter. But for those who understood the context, there was a dark, queasy undercurrent to the laughter. The line between brave confessional comedy and a kind of public cruelty had become terrifyingly thin. He was once again mining his life for material, but this time the collateral damage was the happiness and well-being of his own children. The situation became even more fraught, and the family divisions more permanent when Robert and Melissa decided to get married. The wedding solidified the battle lines. While his sons, Arik and Derek, eventually, and with great reluctance, came to a place of strained acceptance, the bond with his daughter Jessica was completely destroyed. This period of intense personal turmoil coincided paradoxically with what should have been the single greatest professional triumph of his career. After decades of grinding it out in comedy clubs and on late-night talk shows, Hollywood had finally come calling in a major way. The Fox network, recognizing his unique comedic voice and the undeniable drama of his life story, offered him the ultimate prize for a stand-up comedian, his own sitcom. The show, aptly and simply titled Schimmel, was set to be a semi-autobiographical take on his life, starring Robert as a version of himself, a man navigating the chaos of his comedy career, his recent divorce, and his new controversial relationship. The project was legitimate, with a stellar cast that included a young pre-modern family, Ty Burrell, as his quirky brother-in-law. The pilot was shot, and the network executives were thrilled. They saw the potential for a show that was both hilarious and filled with the kind of raw, emotional honesty that was Schimmel's trademark. The show was officially picked up for a full season. Promotional materials were being designed, press releases were being written, and schedules were being drawn up. This was it. This was the culmination of decades of hard work, the moment that would transform him from a successful comedian into a mainstream television star. He was on the verge of a level of success and financial security that he had only ever dreamed of. And then, just as he stood on the precipice of this incredible life-changing achievement, the universe, which had already tested him with a heart attack and a family-destroying scandal, delivered its next most devastating blow. As is standard procedure for any major television production, he was required to undergo a routine physical for the show's insurance policy. It was a formality, a box to be checked. But during the examination, his doctors found something wrong, an anomaly in his blood work. They ordered more tests, a biopsy followed, and then he received the diagnosis. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the immune system. The disease was already at stage 3. The news was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The sitcom, his dream project, the culmination of his life's work, was immediately put on hold. The producers and the network made public statements of support, insisting that they were standing by him and that the show would be waiting for him when he recovered. But in the ruthless, unsentimental world of network television, such promises are often fleeting. The production schedule for a new fall show is an immovable beast. As Schimmel began the arduous, soul-crushing, and physically debilitating process of chemotherapy, the window of opportunity for the show slammed shut. It was quietly, unceremoniously canceled before a single episode beyond the pilot ever aired. The cosmic cruelty of the timing was staggering, almost poetic in its viciousness. The man who had survived a heart attack and weathered a career-threatening scandal had finally, against all odds, gotten his big break, only to have it cruelly snatched away by cancer at the very last second. He was left with no sitcom, no mainstream stardom, no massive payday. He was left only with a debilitating disease and the grueling, uncertain fight for his very life. The wreckage of the preceding years was absolute. In a stunningly short period, Schimmel had seen the dissolution of his first marriage, alienated his daughter in a public and painful scandal, and then, at the very moment of his greatest professional triumph, had his dream sitcom snatched away by a catastrophic cancer diagnosis. It was a sequence of cosmic cruelty, so profound it seemed scripted, a tragedy that went far beyond the scope of any stand-up routine. He was left standing in the ruins of his personal life, his career ambitions, and his own health. For any other person, this would be the end, a time to retreat, to surrender to the overwhelming weight of despair. But for Robert Schimmel, the abyss was not a place of surrender, it was a stage. Armed with a diagnosis that felt like a death sentence, he prepared to do the only thing he had ever done in the face of disaster. He picked up the microphone and began the alchemical process of turning his deepest horror into his next act. To be diagnosed with a life-threatening illness is a profoundly isolating experience. For Robert Schimmel, the isolation was compounded by the cruelest of ironies. He was supposed to be on a soundstage at the Fox network, surrounded by actors, writers, and crew, bringing his life story to the masses in the form of a primetime sitcom. He was supposed to be memorizing lines, arguing with network censors, and doing press junkets. Instead, he found himself in the sterile, silent rooms of an oncology ward, memorizing the names of chemotherapy drugs and listening to doctors explain survival rates. The vibrant, chaotic world of his almost realized dream had been replaced by the grim, methodical reality of fighting for his life. The laughter track of the sitcom was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, unnerving drip of an IV bag. Faced with his own mortality for the second time in just a few years, Schimmel did what he had always done. He fought back with the only weapon he truly trusted, his voice. Cancer became the new, unwilling co-star of his life, and he was determined to write the script. The experience of chemotherapy is a unique and brutal form of physical and psychological warfare. It is a poison designed to kill the traitorous cells within, but in doing so, it wages a punishing campaign against the body it is meant to save. Schimmel, with his innate need to document every indignity, began to catalog the experience not as a patient, but as a comedian gathering material. The relentless nausea, the metallic taste that coated his tongue, the profound bone-deep fatigue, and the strange disorienting experience of his hair falling out in clumps. He observed it all with a kind of detached horror and a journalist's eye for detail. When he was strong enough, he returned to the comedy club stage, not as the man who had survived a heart attack, but as the man who was actively, currently, at war with cancer. He was gaunt, bald from the chemo, and his familiar manic energy was replaced by something more focused, more intense. He walked into the spotlight and began to speak a truth that few people ever dare to articulate in public, let alone try to make funny. He transformed the terrifying lexicon of oncology into punchlines. He talked about the surreal experience of sitting in a chemo suite, looking at the other patients and thinking, this is the world's worst improv group. He joked about chemo brain, the cognitive fog that scrambled his thoughts, comparing it to being permanently stoned without any of the pleasant side effects. He described losing his hair not as a tragedy, but as a final, irreversible surrender to male pattern baldness, a battle he had been losing for years anyway. This was comedy at its most dangerous and most vital. He was taking the ultimate source of human fear, a cancer diagnosis, and refusing to grant it the silent, reverential respect it usually commands. By turning cancer into the antagonist in a stand-up routine, he was diminishing its power over him. He was processing his terror in real time, in front of a live audience, and in doing so, he was providing a strange and profound form of catharsis, not just for himself, but for everyone in the room. He found a new, even more devoted audience. People who were fighting their own battles with illness, or had watched loved ones fight them, flocked to his shows. They saw him not just as a comedian, but as a warrior, a spokesman for the sick who refused to go quietly. He was articulating their fears, their frustrations, and the absurdities of their new medicalized lives. The laughter in his shows during this period was different. It was deeper, more urgent, tinged with a shared understanding of pain and a fierce appreciation for the man on stage who dared to laugh in its face. To further document his journey and to reach an even wider audience, he distilled his experience into a book, released in 2008. The title was Pure, Unadulterated Schimmel: Cancer on $5 a Day, Chemo Not Included, A Guide to Cheating Death. The book was a raw, poignant, and often hysterically funny memoir of his journey through the disorienting landscape of modern medicine and mortality. It was his definitive statement on the illness, a chronicle of his fight that was equal parts medical diary, philosophical reflection, and stand-up routine. The title itself was a perfect encapsulation of his worldview. In the face of the abyss, find the absurdity. Find the joke. Find the hustle. The book was a success, further cementing his new public persona. In a strange and unexpected way, his public battle with cancer became a form of redemption. The lingering controversy over his marriage to Melissa began to fade into the background, overshadowed by this new, more compelling narrative of resilience and courage. He was no longer just the brash comic who married his daughter's friend. He was the guy who was beating cancer and making the world laugh while he did it. And he did beat it. After months of grueling treatment, he went into remission. It was a monumental victory. He had looked death in the eye for a second time and had walked away, battered and scarred, but alive and armed with a whole new hour of killer material. It seemed, for a moment, that he had finally weathered the worst of the storm. He had survived the heart attack, he had survived the cancer, and he had survived the public scandals. A period of calm, of peace seemed not only deserved, but perhaps even possible. But Robert Schimmel's life was never destined for calm. The chaos was a relentless, recurring character in his story. The very relationship that had been born from the ashes of his first marriage, the one that had cost him his relationship with his daughter, began to unravel. His marriage to Melissa, which had survived the incredible strain of his cancer battle, could not, it seemed, survive the peace that followed. The intense pressures that had torn apart his first marriage, the demands of the road, the lack of privacy, the fundamental conflict of a life lived as an open book seemed to resurface in his second. In 2007, they too divorced. He was now in his late 50s, a two-time cancer survivor, twice divorced, and still profoundly estranged from his eldest daughter. The landscape of his life was littered with the wreckage of past battles, even as he had emerged victorious from the most recent one. The turmoil, however, was far from over. A new series of problems, both professional and personal, began to plague him. He found himself in a bitter and public dispute with radio host Howard Stern. For years, Schimmel had been a frequent and celebrated guest on Stern's show, a friend of the court who was always welcome. The platform was enormous and perfectly suited to his brand of transgressive, honest comedy. But a misunderstanding over a booking, a perceived slight, spiraled into a bitter falling out. Schimmel felt disrespected, Stern felt aggrieved, and the result was Schimmel being effectively banned from the show. It was a significant professional blow, cutting him off from one of his largest and most loyal audiences and severing a connection that had been a cornerstone of his career. Then came an even more damaging and soul-crushing event. In 2008, he was arrested in connection with an incident involving the 14-year-old daughter of a woman he was dating at the time. The details as they emerged in the press were murky and deeply disturbing. The accusation was that he had propositioned the young girl over the internet. For a man whose entire comedic identity was already steeped in sexual candor and controversy, the news was a gut punch. It was a scandal that threatened to destroy what was left of his reputation and career. He vehemently and consistently denied the charges, insisting it was a catastrophic misunderstanding, that he had been set up, and that the allegations were completely false. The legal process was a slow, agonizing grind, a period of public humiliation and private terror. For a time, it looked as though his career and his life as he knew it might truly be over. Eventually, after a lengthy investigation, the charges were dropped. Prosecutors stated that there was a lack of evidence and that they could not prove a crime had occurred. He was legally exonerated, a free man. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was immense and lasting. The accusation lingered like a toxic cloud, another dark and complicated chapter in his already stormy life. It was as if the universe was determined to test his limits, to see how many blows one man could withstand before breaking. Just as he was emerging from the wreckage of this legal nightmare, his own body, the site of so many previous battles, delivered yet another devastating blow. He was diagnosed with liver cirrhosis. This was not the stereotypical cirrhosis of an alcoholic. Doctors traced it back to the hepatitis C infection he had contracted decades earlier, most likely from that tainted needle during his time in the Air Force. It was a ticking time bomb that had been silently, patiently destroying his liver for most of his adult life, and it had finally gone off. The disease was advanced. His liver was failing. He was told he would require a liver transplant to survive. His life had become a relentless, almost unbelievable gauntlet of survival. He had survived the heart. He had survived the cancer. He had survived the public shaming and the legal battles. And now, here he was fighting for a new liver, his name added to the impossibly long and uncertain transplant waiting list. Through it all, he never stopped performing. He couldn't. The stage was more than a job. It was his therapy, his confessional, his reason for being. The man audiences saw on stage in these final years was a testament to the sheer, stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to give up. He was visibly unwell, gaunt and frail, but the defiant fire in his eyes was still there. His voice was sometimes weaker, raspier, but his honesty was as sharp and uncompromising as ever. He was a man living on borrowed time, staring down his third fatal diagnosis and still finding a way to wring laughter from the abyss. Having run a relentless gauntlet of survival that would have broken most, Robert Schimmel had earned the title of warrior. He had stared down cancer and won. He had endured the collapse of a second marriage, weathered professional exile, and emerged from the other side of a legal nightmare that would have permanently destroyed a lesser man. His body, a lifelong battleground, had delivered its latest and perhaps final betrayal in the form of liver cirrhosis. Yet he still stood. The man who now took the stage was an accumulation of all these scars, a living testament to the sheer refusal to be erased. But the frantic energy of the fight was now being replaced by the quiet desperation of the wait. The loud public battles against tumors and accusations gave way to a silent, internal struggle against time itself, setting the stage for a final act defined not by defiance, but by a fragile search for peace and a reckoning with a life lived at full volume. The final chapter of Robert Schimmel's life was defined by a profound and unnerving quiet. For a man whose existence had been a relentless sequence of dramatic events, of diagnoses, scandals, breakdowns, and comebacks, the new reality was one of waiting. To be on a transplant list is to live in a state of suspended animation. Life is dictated by a pager or a cell phone, a small electronic tether, to a future that may or may not arrive. Every day is a gamble, a tense negotiation between the slow, steady decay of one's own body and the hope that somewhere a tragedy for another family will become a miracle for yours. It is a grim and complicated hope, and Schimmel, a man who had always exerted a semblance of control over his narrative by turning it into comedy, was now utterly powerless. He couldn't write a punchline that would move his name up the list. He couldn't deliver a monologue that would regenerate his liver. All he could do was wait. During this period of enforced stillness, something remarkable began to happen. Amidst the physical decline, there were the first tentative signs of emotional healing. For years, the chaos of his life had been a destructive force, particularly on his family. Now, faced with the very real prospect of his death, the walls that had been built by anger and betrayal began to show cracks. He was in a new, stable relationship with his girlfriend, Lisa, who provided a much-needed anchor of support, in the perpetual storm, but more significantly, the deep frozen rift between him and his daughter Jessica began to thaw. The years of pain and estrangement, born from his marriage to her friend, had created a wound that seemed permanent. Yet the shared trauma of his endless health battles, the sheer accumulation of suffering, had begun to slowly, carefully bridge that divide. The process was not one of grand Hollywood reconciliations, but of small human gestures, tentative phone calls, hesitant visits, conversations that navigated the minefield of past hurts to focus on the terrifying present. In seeing her father, a man she had once seen as an indomitable, if infuriating force of nature, now so physically vulnerable, so clearly finite, the hard edges of old anger began to soften into a more complex sorrow. It was a fragile, imperfect peace, a recognition that the ties of family, however strained and damaged, still held some power against the finality of death. It seemed possible that after so many years of public conflict and private pain, the Schimmel family might find its way back to some semblance of wholeness before it was too late. He had cheated death so many times, had stared down so many seemingly certain ends, that it was almost impossible for those around him not to believe he would do it again. The call for a new liver, they all hoped, was not a matter of if, but when. Through it all, as his body grew weaker, he continued to find his way to the stage. It was a pilgrimage. The microphone was his pulpit, his confessional, his lifeline. In those final performances, the man on stage was a spectral figure, a ghost of the boisterous, energetic comic he had once been. But the power was still there, transformed into something else. The comedy was now imbued with an almost unbearable poignancy. He was a living library of human suffering, and his act was a tour through the wreckage. He would stand in the spotlight, a frail man with a giant, defiant voice, and synthesize the entire tragic arc of his life into a single set. The heart attack, the cancer, the divorces, the scandals, and now the liver patiently, methodically dying inside him. It was all there. The laughter he elicited from the crowd was no longer just about the shock of his candor. It was mixed with a palpable sense of awe, of empathy, of witnessing something sacred and fleeting. They were laughing with a man who was living on borrowed time, a man who was literally dying on stage and using the experience to make one final defiant statement. As long as you can talk about the thing that is killing you, you are still alive. On the evening of August 26, 2010, the drama of Robert Schimmel's life took a hard left turn into the mundane. There were no doctors, no diagnoses, no public scandals. It was just a warm Arizona night and a simple drive. He was in the car with two of his children. His 19-year-old daughter from his second marriage, Aaliyah, was at the wheel, and his 11-year-old son, Jacob, was also a passenger. They were on a freeway near Phoenix, a ribbon of asphalt under an indifferent sky. In a sudden, chaotic instant, the kind of random split-second event that happens 1,000 times a day on highways across the country, another car cut them off. Aaliyah swerved to avoid a collision. It was a reflexive, instinctual maneuver, the right and only thing to do. But in that split second, she lost control of the vehicle. The car rolled over, a violent metallic tumble of breaking glass and twisted steel. In the immediate stunned aftermath, Jacob, thankfully, was found to have escaped with only minor injuries. Aaliyah, however, was in critical condition, but Robert, in the passenger seat, had borne the brunt of the violent impact. He was rushed to the hospital with catastrophic injuries. The great talker, the man whose voice was his entire identity, was now silent, unconscious, kept alive by the steady rhythm of machines. He was placed in a medically induced coma as doctors tried to assess the scale of the damage. His family, a fractured unit, now suddenly tragically reunited, rushed to his bedside. His children, his ex-wives, his girlfriend Lisa, and his daughter Jessica, with whom he had just begun to build a fragile peace, all gathered in the sterile quiet of the hospital. They held a vigil, a desperate 9-day marathon of hope against hope, praying for one more of his impossible, miraculous recoveries. They watched and waited for the man who had been so public with all his pain to emerge from this final silent battle. But there would be no comeback this time. There would be no new hour of material born from this fresh hell. The damage was too extensive, the trauma too severe. After 9 days of clinging to a life that had already been stretched to its absolute limit, his body could fight no more. On September 3, 2010, Robert Schimmel died. The official cause was blunt force trauma sustained in the accident. The irony was a punch to the gut, a cosmic joke so cruel it defied laughter. The man who had fought and beaten stage 3 cancer, who had survived a massive heart attack and was patiently waiting for a life-saving liver transplant, was ultimately killed by a random swerve on a Tuesday night. It was a senseless, anticlimactic, and profoundly mundane end to a life that had been anything but. His daughter Aaliyah would eventually recover from her physical injuries, but she would be left to carry the memory of that night for the rest of her life, a psychological burden almost as heavy as the ones her father had so famously carried and exercised on stage. So what, in the end, is the legacy of Robert Schimmel? He was never a household name in the way that Jerry Seinfeld or David Letterman were. His comedy was too raw, his life too messy, his truths too uncomfortable for mainstream superstardom. But his influence on the art form of stand-up comedy is deep and undeniable. He was a quintessential comedian's comedian, revered by his peers for his fearless, almost pathological honesty and his masterful ability to spin the straw of tragedy into comedic gold. He took the deeply personal, confessional style of a pioneer like Richard Pryor and pushed it to its logical and often illogical extreme. He created a working blueprint for the generation of comics that followed, proving that the most powerful material could be found in the darkest, most private corners of one's own life. More than that, his life serves as a profound, if painful, meditation on the complex, often parasitic relationship between art and suffering. Schimmel's comedic genius was inextricably fused to his personal pain. He could not have had one without the other. To entertain strangers, he laid his life bare, dissecting his own wounds under the spotlight. And while this act brought him a devoted following and a place in the comedy pantheon, it came at an immense personal cost, alienating and wounding the very people he loved the most. His story stands as a cautionary tale about the seductive power of the spotlight and the inherent danger of turning your entire life, your marriages, your children, your diseases, your deepest shames, into a performance. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy, however, is the sheer bloody-minded resilience he embodied. He was knocked down again and again and again, sometimes by his own poor choices, sometimes by public scorn, and often by the cruel, random lottery of disease. But he always got back up. He always found his way back to the microphone, to the single place on earth where he made sense. He operated on a simple, powerful belief that as long as you could talk about the thing that was trying to destroy you, it had not yet won. In his final years, he showed thousands of people, especially those staring down their own grim diagnoses, that laughter wasn't just the best medicine. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was a way to spit in the eye of despair, to find a flicker of light in the absolute darkness, and to reclaim your own humanity from the clutches of an illness that seeks to strip it away. Robert Schimmel's life was not a neat narrative with a clear moral. It was a chaotic, contradictory, and deeply flawed masterpiece of the human experience. He was a loving father who inflicted deep wounds on his children. He was a courageous warrior against disease who often seemed to be his own worst enemy. He was a purveyor of what many considered lowbrow humor, who possessed a profound and nuanced understanding of the human condition. In the end, he was simply a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of lying, especially about himself. He couldn't help but tell the truth, no matter the consequences. And his truth, as ugly, uncomfortable, and painful as it often was also riotously, beautifully, and tragically funny. He left the stage far too early, but the echo of his raw, unapologetic voice and his defiant laughter in the face of it all remains.